Grateful now to introduce our main speaker today. So those of you that might have seen Johnny's talk last week, talking about kind of the importance of urban nature recovery, we have here Kabir Kaul, who is a 18-year-old conservationist writer, activist. I don't know how, well, I'll let you describe yourself as well, from London, who's going to talk with us about this really important issue. I mean, the vast majority of us live in cities, so urban nature is so important to our daily lives, our well-being. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to Kabir to let him tell us about his experiences.
Thank you. Does this mic work? Can everyone hear me? Okay, brilliant. Can everyone still hear me if I talk like this?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Hi everyone, really great to be here. Thank you so much. It's a real honour and a privilege to be here today at the Oxford Martin School. My name is Kabir Kaul. I'm an 18-year-old conservationist, writer and campaigner from London. This morning, I'd like to share with you my personal experiences of nature recovery in London by illustrating the challenges it faces and the solutions seeking to overcome them.
It's not working, just it'll be because it's around 2 seconds.
It'll start working. It's just gone. It should work.
Sorry.
Will that work?
Yeah, that's how it works.
The second slide isn't there, but I've worked with a number of different organisations over the past few years, including the past 6 years, including the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, the Royal Society of Arts, and a number of different conservation organisations that engage with all communities in London, including young people on a local scale, and I'll pick out a few of those. I've been working with the RSPB for the past 5 years as a member of their youth council, helping to provide a youth representation in their internal and external decision making. And as an extension of that role during my gap year, I've been a specialist volunteer in their policy department, looking at swift policy around England and Scotland and urban nature friendly design. I've also, most relevant to this talk, very recently, between 2022 and 2023, I've been a member of the London Rewilding Taskforce, so that's an advisory role at the Greater London Authority, London's devolved government body. And we were responsible for drafting London's first ever framework on rewilding. So what's the problem? What are the challenges that nature recovery faces in London? Well, nature is an intrinsic part of London's land area. 47% of the capital consists of green space. That's 68,000 hectares, roughly 40% of which is SINC, sites of importance for nature conservation. And these are sites that are supposed to be managed for nature conservation and nature recovery in London. This is the Nature Reserves of London map. It's a map that I made in 2019. It was the first of its kind. It shows all the different nature reserves and publicly accessible wildlife sites in London. But in this context, it's deceptive because the points that it shows on the map are only 40% of London's green space. These are the protected wildlife sites. And I'm using SINCs here as a general guide. There are many gardens, schools and other private areas which are not accessible to the public, which are bringing back nature to their doorsteps on a local scale. But the vast majority of areas that are being utilised for nature's recovery are anyway designated as SINCs. So I'm using it as a general guide. However, that does leave an astonishing up to 60% of green space that isn't managed at all for biodiversity. This is detrimental to both our well-being and the ecosystem resilience needed to tackle climate change. If ecosystems degrade, then cities are not sustainable. To reduce these risks, that 60% must be utilised for nature's recovery. The solution is threefold. We need, for successful nature recovery in London, we need the public, the ultimate driver of all nature recovery efforts, to understand what biodiverse green space is and what it isn't. Secondly, we need environmental education of my generation and future generations to develop skills and lasting commitment well into the future. And thirdly, we need the formulation and delivery of high quality, expert-led policy. I must say here, the challenges and solutions that I'm suggesting here are related to my own experiences as a conservationist, activist and campaigner over the past 6 years, and are by no means the full picture or a silver bullet. Similarly, so are the examples of each challenge and solution I'm giving here today. They're based on my personal experiences. So firstly, the first challenge that nature recovery in London faces is developing public understanding of nature. The greatest challenge for nature's recovery in London is the public's expectation of ecological tidiness. People associate nature with certain aesthetics, mowed lawns, beautiful brightly coloured flowers, and country gardens so precisely manicured that they could have been painted by John Constable. Here is Eastcote House Gardens in northwest London, where I live. It's a beautiful garden, beautiful to look at, very symmetrical, very manicured, but it's no welcome place for biodiversity. The conservation of not nature, but of our image of nature has led to scoured wildflower meadows, splintered woodlands, and has, as Professor Lorimer's researched, removal of rot and decay from our ecosystem is a key part of our nutrient cycles. Moreover, cultural beliefs about landscapes have persisted for centuries, whether that's through art, literature, or music. This also influences the culture of tidiness that persists today, which I believe some of you are researching at the moment using examples in England and Scotland. Here is Wormwood Scrubs in northwest London. Landscapes like these are becoming increasingly rare, with hedgerows and scrubland with habitat for skylarks, windchats, and stonechats. These are becoming increasingly rarer. And as these landscapes have become dire places for our birds, bees, and butterflies, perceptions of them have been shaped by biodiversity's very decline. According to the State of Nature report in 2023, the species studied in that report had, on average, declined by 19% since 1970, and now at least 1 in 6 of those species is at risk of extinction. One vehicle to help increase the public interest in nature is encouraging people to leave part or all of their garden space for nature. However, gardens are no exception when it comes to nature's decline in London. Between 1998 and 2008, 3,000 hectares of garden greenery was lost. That's the equivalent of 2.5 Hyde Parks being lost per year. Only 14% of the capital's gardens remain biodiverse with vegetation today, but private gardens still comprise nearly half of London's green space, presenting a simple solution for the public to turn the tide of tidiness. And as you can see here, although we've lost so much over the past few years, gardens still make up a huge amount of London's green space. You can see that on this map of Greater London here. Now, during the pandemic, many people got out into nature for the first time. They realized the mental health and well-being benefits of being out in nature, especially in their gardens where they could perhaps hear birdsong or look at wildflowers. And that encouraged lots of people to garden for nature for the first time. And in some way, shape or form, certain campaigns like No Mow May and Let It Bloom June are helping to increase and maintain that momentum by encouraging people to leave a little bit of their garden space for nature. And I started gardening for nature during the pandemic as well. You can see on the left-hand side, that's my garden in 2016, well before the pandemic. It's just a mowed lawn. On the right-hand side, there's a bit more vegetation. That's after the pandemic. A little bit more vegetation, but as you can see, my dad still likes his mowed lawns. So it's a family compromise. We're not going to win every single battle for nature, but nonetheless, we have made progress there. We've got a pond with lovely newts and rowan and cherry trees as well. But a significant proportion of Londoners don't have a balcony, let alone a garden, where they could potentially make a difference for wildlife. Therefore, the urban greening of communal spaces is equally as imperative. Again, the public's preference for ecological tidiness is not going to shift overnight. So public urban greening will also have to make compromises. The redesigning of Grosvenor Square on the Grosvenor estate in the city of Westminster is a very good example of this and how this has been achieved. The estate wanted to combine a manicured park with naturalistic meadows. You can see that manicured oval in the centre and surrounded by all those trees. Around those trees and underneath those trees, there's meadows and wetlands. Between 2020 and 2022, 3,300 residents participated in consultations, many of whom don't actually have balconies, as well as external practitioners in biodiversity, including myself. I was brought in to advise how we can bring more birds to Grosvenor Square. However, the estate's very wealthy and local residents are of very high socio-economic backgrounds, so they'd be able to have better access to nature if they really wanted to. Nevertheless, it does demonstrate that residents can participate in the nature recovery on their own doorsteps. And you can see some of those naturalistic meadows there. The second challenge facing nature's recovery in London is the environmental education of my generation. Nature's recovery is a permanent commitment that transcends generations. To ensure longevity, mine and future generations need a foundational understanding of nature, alongside a lasting pipeline of talent. Young people must be prioritised in any nature recovery project, as they have the responsibility as future custodians of the natural world. They're not going to be able to appreciate what they've never seen or been taught about. Because of biodiversity decline, the rise of the internet, and many other factors, there is a deficit in both young people's connection and access to nature. In fact, according to the RSPB in 2016, only 21% of urban 8 to 12-year-olds are actually connected to nature. It's even more difficult to access nature if you're from an ethnic minority or deprived background. In areas where ethnic minority Londoners are at least 40% of the population, they have 11 times less access, less green space than in predominantly white areas. And 35% of Londoners from low socio-economic backgrounds visit green space less than once a month. I'm now going to introduce another layer to this. This is a map of areas of deficiency in London, and that's calculated by London's local environmental records centre. You can see those are the black splodges on the map. They are areas where people have to walk at least 1 kilometre to their nearest protected wildlife site. So those are green spaces that are actually supposed to be managed for nature's recovery. In fact, I live in one of them. I have to walk quite some way to my nearest protected wildlife site. So many Londoners, including young people, lack easy access to wildlife sites, not just regular green spaces that are undermanaged for biodiversity. Younger generations will accept the lack of biodiversity around them as how their environment should be, not that it isn't what it used to be. Only environmental education can turn around this shifting baseline. Now, through the media, there is a growing awareness of climate change among my generation. Despite this, eco-anxiety is still rife, as opportunities to make a difference are few and far between. I set up a wildlife society at my school when I was at school, and with my friends we created a pond and a wildflower meadow, which we observed and maintained throughout the seasons. But that was only possible because we had the support of my headmaster and science technicians, both of whom, just by complete coincidence, happened to be ornithologists. That's just a complete coincidence. If we are to foster a generation of nature-loving, nature-literate young people, opportunities to learn about nature must be introduced systemically, not in a piecemeal way. A natural history GCSE, which I helped campaign for back in 2020 with the naturalist Mary Colwell, it'll be taught from 2025, hopefully. And not only will it introduce foundational concepts of ecology to students, but it will make nature more relevant to them through local practical conservation. And most importantly, it will imbue my generation and future generations with a great sense of empowerment. If anything, it's going to improve their well-being, but the most passionate students might springboard into specialist traineeships like the London Wildlife Trust's Keeping It Wild. And that's a traineeship, it's a paid traineeship for young people, particularly from ethnic minority backgrounds and from deprived backgrounds across London, where they'll learn for 4 months how to manage habitats across the capital, whether that's woodlands, wetlands, or everything in between, I guess. And since 2018, they've trained 60 trainees. And partly as a result of that, they've been able to deliver 415 learning sessions for 10,000 children in just 1 year. It's remarkable. The GCSE will only succeed with adequate timetabling and staff, and a pipeline of specialist talent is only possible if teachers actively direct passionate students to traineeships in post-16 education. But systemic initiatives like these will not bear fruit immediately, so they must be complemented with more short-term initiatives. And as an example, this is where 70 nest boxes for 70 years comes in. This is an initiative which I led during the Platinum Jubilee celebrations to engage more young people across London with nature. And I led a coalition of small nature charities in doing this. Our aim was simple. It was to get at least 70 schools signed up to this project, and each and every one of them would receive a nest box, which they could use to introduce young people to urban nature in a very simple way, just by noticing and appreciating the nesting birds in their school grounds. And in total, we thought we'd only get 70 signing up, but we got 106. And each of those received a garden nest box. And if schools wanted a swift nest box, they also received that as well if they were deemed suitable. So 20 swift boxes were also donated. In total, our project engaged with over 59,000 children who in some way, shape or form are going to be introduced to urban nature. And I was very pleased because the last nest box of the campaign made it to the garden of Downing Street. So I was very pleased to see the impact of that in just a short space of time. But of course, projects like these can be scaled for impact. Now, the third and final challenge for nature recovery in London is to improve nature policy across local government. The delivery of high quality nature recovery must be supported through aligned local policy overseen by experts. Policy alignment across councils is imperative because ecosystem management depends on a London-wide coherent approach. Of course, central government has a fundamental role in setting biodiversity policy, but in London it's largely the responsibility of the 33 local authorities and the Greater London Authority, which coordinates policy between those 33 authorities. So only local government's going to be covered here today. Policy is dependent on the understanding held by each local authority. And I've seen councils with very varied understandings of nature. If local councils lack consensus on nature's role in London and its communities, then green spaces and protected wildlife sites cannot be, to quote John Lawton, bigger, better and more joined up within and between London borough boundaries. I've also observed that some councils are significantly more progressive than others in their approach to nature policy. And I'm going to use two London boroughs to illustrate that. On the one hand, you've got the London Borough of Hackney in Inner London, and they've published very recently, in just the past few months, the first ever local nature recovery plan of a London borough. It's even endorsed the creation of floating islands in the Regent's Canal by local communities. These are very cool. I've helped to build some of them. They help to clean up the water in the Regent's Canal using native plants like purple loosestrife and yellow flag iris, and also they help to enhance the ecosystem overall. Now, on the other hand, you've got Outer London Borough Hillingdon, where I live, and they've had the same approach for years. They manage green spaces pretty well for wildlife, I must say, but community involvement in that management is not very well publicised. So perhaps the use of social media, for instance, could engage many more potentially interested residents with nature recovery projects. The lack of coherence and approach across London could be minimised through further collaboration and education. There's the London Borough Biodiversity Forum, where councils can exchange ideas on conservation. Personally, I think they need to publicise themselves better to show how this is working in practice, but nonetheless, forums like those serve a critical function. A further solution to join up local government thinking is by increasing nature recovery opportunities for every council in London, shaped and developed by experts. And this is where I'll talk about the London Rewilding Taskforce. There's little me on the front bench there, not too far away from Sadiq Khan, the mayor. So the London Rewilding Taskforce was a body set up by Sadiq Khan that between 2022 and 2023, whose responsibility it was to draw up a framework for rewilding in London. And we came up with 3 recommendations for him to implement and for councils across London to implement. Firstly, we identified 11 large-scale rewilding zones in London where landscape-scale nature recovery could take place. As you can see, they're mainly on the outer fringes of London, where there are large areas of countryside. In fact, it even includes places in Hillingdon, large areas of countryside there in the northwest of London. Secondly, we want to join up both protected wildlife sites and green corridors, to form green corridors, protected wildlife sites and undermanaged green spaces to form wildlife corridors to improve climate resilience and improve people's access to nature. And thirdly, we wanted to engage people in those projects, increase public participation in all sorts of nature recovery projects. So we had quite a large role in doing that, and all of that will be fed into the local nature recovery strategy for London, which is currently being drafted at the moment. And that is London's overarching local nature recovery plan. Now, for delivery, the Mayor did grant over £2 million in funding for nature recovery projects in at least 23 of the 33 local authorities. However, it can be said that all of these are merely recommendations. The Mayor and councils don't have to follow through with them at all. There is a risk that not every council will prioritise them in the long term for many different reasons, and even if delivery does begin, it may not continue after an administration change, for instance. Now on to policy delivery. Even if there is joined up thinking across councils on nature policy, we cannot expect that to be translated into successful delivery overnight. Actors have many different quantities of resources: people, materials, money, and expertise. Work is carried out by landowners and contractors who, like in any context, need frequent and knowledgeable oversight during the delivery of different projects. More trained ecologists and other specialists are needed to advise delivery partners on how best to manage habitats for nature recovery, including additional interventions that would enhance biodiversity in the built environment. For example, the circulation of best practice guidance on how to install swift bricks or installing sustainable drainage systems. Here are two examples of where careless mistakes have led to catastrophic effects, particularly on the left-hand side, where contractors have not been advised very well, not been advised at all on how to manage green spaces for wildlife. On the left-hand side, a contractor in East London has mowed a meadow during the breeding season, destroying many skylark and corn bunting nests. And on the right-hand side is pure carelessness. It's quite funny, actually. This swift tower has been placed lying on its side. It should be upright. People have seemingly forgotten about it. But these are careless mistakes that could have easily been avoided through better and more frequent oversight. By contrast, an example of a project that has been led well by experts is the delivery of green roofs in the borough of Greenwich in southeast London. IKEA wanted to build a green roof on their store there, enhancing biodiversity, storing rainwater, and reducing heating and cooling costs inside buildings. Delivery of this roof and many others in the borough have been overseen by European Green Roof Authority, Dr. Dusty Gedge, and as a result, the borough now has the largest green roof area in London. When I went to visit it, it was absolutely remarkable. There's habitat for black redstarts, there's habitat for all sorts of pollinators, bees and butterflies. And at the time I visited in 2021, Dr. Gedge thought that there were the first breeding pair of lints on a green roof anywhere in Europe. Overall, a joined-up approach with expert delivery oversight will ensure that councils and delivery partners are able to work together on recovery. A pipeline of specialist talent will ensure longevity, although of course sufficient funding and perhaps some incentives as well may be needed to sustain these efforts well into the future. So in summary then, success is underpinned by three things: public awareness and commitment, a good foundational understanding of the natural world among my generation and future generations, with a sufficient number of people equipped with relevant skills and specialisms, and oversight of policy formulation and delivery by specialists and experts. In fact, it's experts that we need, including yourselves, to inform every single stage of this approach. From working with local government and the private sector, to shaping how young people will learn about the natural world, and providing the interventions to enhance our urban ecosystems, your work is imperative. I must reiterate that the examples that I've given here today are not the full picture or a silver bullet. But I'm optimistic that if the principles behind these success stories can be followed and applied across London, then we will be able to successfully restore our urban habitats, protect our urban wildlife, and reconnect the public with urban nature. Thank you very much.
Anybody have any questions?
Yes.
Yeah, I went to the Oxfordshire Nature Recovery Strategy consultation feedback session yesterday online, and they said that they basically, Mark, you might know more about this, that they weren't really looking at the urban areas and they were only recording, I wasn't following it very carefully, but sort of green spaces that were over half a hectare big. And they were just completely ignoring the, well, I might be wrong though, but the urban bit. But it just seems like you've got such a strong message there. Has that message sort of gone into other councils that you know of, or other parts of the?
I'm not sure. Well, in London, I think one point that was raised at the task force is that, and as I hinted at, well, as I highlighted in the talk there, that nature knows no boundaries. There must be joined up efforts across London borough boundaries and across counties as well. One point that was raised from Citizen Zoo in Kingston, I remember in one meeting, was that they said that there's all this fantastic nature recovery and rewilding projects that's going on in the southwest of London. But in the long term, we need to bring up those efforts across the county boundary in Surrey. But I'm not sure how that's, I'm not sure what efforts have been made so far to coordinate different authorities across county boundaries to do that, because and I've been learning this during my gap year. About 14 years ago, planning policy did consider landscape scale decision making a lot better. But since planning rules and regulations have changed, it's all sort of been restricted to local authority boundaries. So I hope that in some way that's also possible. There's also been the removal of the duty to cooperate by the recent Levelling Up Regeneration Act. So on certain policy areas, councils no longer have a legal obligation to talk to one another on certain proposals, but perhaps in due course there could be that gap could be filled by something to do with nature. That local authorities must work together for nature, and I would love to see that, especially as there's a lot of momentum now building on these local nature recovery strategies. Well, I can see that in London, but I'm not sure about other areas in England. That's a real shame that they're not considering those urban areas, but I really hope they do so in due course. And when they're doing that, they consider that there are people who live, who are maybe commuting into these towns and cities. There are people who are benefiting from nature in different areas, and there needs to be an understanding that nature can't just exist in one place. It needs to exist across local authority boundaries and within local authority boundaries. And that's really interesting. Yes.
Are you going?
You mentioned that many gardens are managed for an image of nature, yeah, domesticated, pretty. So when you are trying to do your rewilding projects, I'm sure you have some pushbacks that they look weedy, they look neglected, full of weeds, whatever. So I wonder how you manage this clash of narratives in your work.
Yeah, it is something that is often hard to convince people, and we're not going to be able to win every battle. There is almost always going to be an element of compromise where you'll have some mowed lawn at the end of the day that's going to stay there. But what we've been thinking of, and what these large-scale rewilding projects here might aim to do, is that at the moment there's a successor group to the London Rewilding Taskforce that's considering pilot projects. So if we know in the past that there's been some positive responses to nature recovery projects, like in Enfield, where Johnny's been doing some research on beavers, the community's responded very well to that, and that their perceptions of nature have been very positive. So if there are more pilot projects that there are more areas that we can identify like that, where we could run pilot projects, then we could perhaps investigate after that where that could be applied successfully across London. But I'm not sure how that's been done in the past, but it is a bit of a challenge. People definitely like manicured gardens. I don't think that's something we can get rid of, but if we can at least shine a light on the importance of wildlife gardening or making space for nature, especially where people receive that positively, then I think that a difference could be made there.
Great talk. So I have one comment and a couple of questions. So just looking at the map, which you're showing, most of the recommended large-scale rewilding opportunities are present at the peripheries of London.
Yeah.
Right, one. Second, that's usually the area which is, not as densely populated. And then you also showed a map where there were deprived areas or where nature deficient areas.
The areas of deficiency.
So if we look at that, it doesn't, if you compare this map with the map you're showing the rewilding opportunities, obviously it's virtually impossible to create new green spaces in urban built areas which are already densely built. How do you see that? How can we change the existing green spaces? Like you mentioned, how people do like their lawns to be mowed and they do not, want it to be a wildlife sanctuary for birds and wildlife to come in. So how do you see that integration? Because people who are living in central London or in a very densely populated areas would not want to walk to those peripheries or drive 10, 15 kilometers to, access those things. So how would that help in people getting access to green spaces, but also being connected to nature?
Yeah, that's really, really good points. Really, really good. I think, this with the areas of deficiency, I think there's two things I'd say there. Firstly, with the Rewild London Fund, the money that's been set aside for urban greening and recovery projects across London, that's not limited to the outer London peripheries. All these areas of deficiency here are being, many of them are being rewilded or being utilised for nature's recovery using these projects. There are areas in Barnes, there are areas in Bexley in southeast London, and areas which are very built up, very urban areas that are connecting both protected wildlife sites and undermanaged green spaces for biodiversity. So that will help to increase people's access to nature, particularly in urban areas. You can see in Enfield as well. There's a very large area of deficiency, and perhaps some work is going on there. I'm not sure, but there's definitely work going on across London to close up these areas of deficiency. Secondly, yes, although there aren't many areas of deficiency on outer London, there's also a matter of perception as well. I think, and it's a theory, but this is something I've come across, even though many people live in the countryside on the outskirts of London, and those areas may be suitable for rewilding, they may take that space for granted. And that is because there's something I've noticed with the 70 Nest Boxes project. Many people in inner London seem to value nature and opportunities to engage with nature a lot more than in outer London. The number of people that signed up to our project to receive nest boxes in inner London was much greater than in outer London. And that's because in outer London, I'm assuming people would have taken nature for granted and they would have thought, oh, we've got all this lovely green space around us, but we can engage children with nature that way. But many people, like in deprived areas like Tower Hamlets and Newham, loads of people signed up. We had 9 in Haringey in northwest London. We had 8 in Tower Hamlets because they had opportunities to engage with nature was few and far between. So I think there's two things there. There's firstly, work has begun to help close up those gaps in inner city London where people lack access to protected wildlife sites using through the creation of green corridors. And secondly, even in those outer London peripheries, people can enjoy nature, but it's all about making them aware that nature is in their doorstep, and even though they're surrounded by nature, may not already necessarily be aware of it. Sorry, I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you.
Hi, can I ask a quick one about connectivity? So I work with a number of London universities. So UAL, University of Arts London, which is 6 arts universities, UCL, King's College London, Imperial. They're all kind of committed in our nature positive project. So I just wondered if there's an opportunity for them, if they're not want to engage with you, to facilitate some of those corridors using their land and buildings and roofs and things.
I'm not sure what's I haven't yet come across the work of university. That'd be really interesting to learn more about and more about.
I think they'd be really open to it. There's some of them are starting to do. I mean, there's various things, but I know UCL have got a big BACT project, especially on their East London campus and that near the Olympic Village sort of area. But yeah, it'd be great to connect afterwards and tell them what they can do. I think they'd love to be part of that.
Yeah, that'd be really exciting. Yes.
Hello, thank you. It's a really interesting talk and an amazing amount of sort of commitment and knowledge you've got. And I'm kind of interested to hear what you're thinking of doing next. You said you're on a gap here. I'll be interested to hear if you feel like London rewilding is where you want to focus in the future, or what you might
So I'm
do?
going to be studying geography for the next 3 years at university, and that will give me breadth and an introduction to many different areas of nature, of science, and urban areas as well. And that'd be really really fun. But at the end of that, I think I've used London as my starting point. I would very much like to continue work in London, but I'd also like to go to other urban areas, see what they're doing, see what we can perhaps learn from other urban areas around the world, what lessons the UK can take from that, and that would be really good to shine a light on that. Initially I wanted to be a broadcaster, to do just that, to raise awareness of nature in cities and ways in which people are protecting and enhancing nature in cities. But having been at the London Rewilding Taskforce, also having an interest in politics as well as nature, I've realised at the end of this gap year, I wanted to go into nature policy. And that's because I felt that that's where a lot of difference can be made alongside campaigning, changing the rules, writing the rules, and influencing politicians and decision makers on how best to make decisions for nature. So I think that's where I would want to go primarily, but on the side, perhaps if the opportunity arises, broadcasting as well, to let people know, especially as most people will be living in urban areas. 68% of people will be living in urban areas by 2050. I think it'd be increasingly relevant to more and more people to learn about the urban nature on their doorstep, and I want to shine a light on that. Yes.
So just a great talk. And personally, I'm really inspired, but I know probably there was not just you, but like the effort to get all these nest boxes out there. I think one, just seeing actually the difference that can make, but also kind of understanding of like where we can make a difference within our own built up urban areas. I think oftentimes environmentalism, nature recovery, we look afield to another country where we don't actually have the cultural context. So that's personally inspiring. I have a sort of technical question. It's just for knowledge, because I've had lots of chats with Martha about defining what green space is and nature green space. So there are certain types of green space, like playing fields, where it will need to be managed for recreation. Do you exclude them from that? Like, how do you, when you're looking at, okay, this could be managed for biodiversity, how do you make that judgment? Are there kind of criteria, or is that something that Natural England does? So how do you sort of say, well, you could have nature here, whereas something like a cricket pitch, it's like, you know, it's never going to be managed for, probably, even though it could be, but that would be at the deprivation of a cricket team where you have, you know, that sort of this trade-off. So yeah, I know there's lots of trade-offs with gardens and aesthetics, but were there other sort of trade-offs you encountered where you have to say, well, never actually get biodiversity into these green areas? Some of the large football parks where there's pitch after pitch, and it's like, well, there can be biodiversity there, but it's fairly hard to have that and recreation.
Yeah, I think it does. It does on a case-by-case basis. There probably are trade-offs and compromises all the time. I haven't come across one myself, but I'm sure it happens where these green corridors are being created in certain in certain areas of London, with protected wildlife sites, with urban green spaces being joined up. I think if there were playing fields, there would be consultations, but I don't know how local community would receive that. And I hope they will be given a fair chance to make their views heard. But at the same time, one of the campaigns that I've helped to lead over the past few years is a campaign to save Warren Farm in West London.
Mm-hmm.
Warren Farm is home to a quarter. I'll just get some water.
Sorry, I feel
Yes, so Warren Farm is home to a quarter of London's skylarks.
Yeah.
And the local council wanted to build football pitches there. They've been wanting to build pitches there for at least 2-3 years now. And we gained a lot of momentum and support. And our key argument was, firstly, there are at least 50 football pitches relatively nearby which people could use. The argument the council was putting forward was this space is being used for nature, but people aren't actively getting out there and exercising. People need football pitches for their health and well-being. Mm-hmm. So their main argument was there are enough facilities for people to exercise properly. Mm-hmm. The second argument was that the council had actually identified more suitable sites than Warren Farm to develop for sports pitch provision. So it does matter on a case-by-case basis. Eventually, we won that case, and now we're working with the council to restore that meadow for nature and to protect it and secure local nature reserve designation. And the vast majority of the community there were supportive of skylarks and nature being on that site, because they also knew that there were football pitches next door and there were more suitable sites that could potentially be redeveloped. So I think it does matter on a case-by-case basis, but I'm not sure of any other examples other than that where there have been perhaps conflicts between different communities over different spaces. But I think we might see that play out as these projects are implemented over the next 10, 20 years.
No, that's fascinating. And I think sometimes it's framed as an either or, and I've seen examples where you can have a football pitch, but you can have a wild area in the same. It doesn't, like often with the zoning approach, it's just like that's recreation, that's nature, and actually I think we need a blurring of those lines.
It's a black and white picture, because when I go to my local playing fields, which is 10 minutes down the road, there's hardly any biodiversity. It's all mowed and people use it for football and everything, and I completely understand that. That's what people like to do. But on the on the margins, on the edges of the playing fields, you've got these beautiful hedgerows, hawthorn and blackthorn. That's where all the biodiversity is. So compromises can be made. I think it's also important to convey to people, as you said, it's not always a black and white picture. There can be compromises that are made.
Cool, thank you, amazing work.
Yes.
Hi. So the football pitch stuff, the British Hedgehog Preservation Society now has a football league. And we've got basically teams around the country fighting against each other. We've got non-league teams taking on Premiership teams as to who is doing the most for hedgehogs with the land they manage. So there is stuff going ahead with that. But actually, the question was, a lot of the biggest sort of threats that are going to hit places like London in the near future are just going to become unbearably hot during the summer.
Yeah.
And you're focusing on looking at sort of urban nature through the lens of biodiversity. But I'm just thinking in terms of trying to manage the heat sink effect, trying to get greenery back into cities, whether that is possibly even a more effective way of getting biodiversity, is ignoring biodiversity and talk about physical benefits.
I think, well, if you bring the habitats back, there'll definitely be biodiversity. I think in some places, especially in areas where, so there's flooding, there's heat waves and droughts that become increasingly more severe in cities around the world, including in London, especially around the Thames as well, and around its tributaries. Areas can flood a lot more easily now. But I think that there's always an element of biodiversity there. In places where perhaps we can't always change people's perceptions, in places where maybe it's not always cost effective, or places where it's just not feasible. Maybe if there's a concrete embankment that would be very expensive to remove, for instance, or something like that, maybe we can harness the habitats and make sure we can find some sort of solution on a small scale to deal with those issues. So it may not always be suitable or safe to use nature and habitats as the example, but I'm sure that can happen in most cases. But yes, I see what you're saying, that maybe it's not always necessary to inform people of biodiversity and that part of it, because the biodiversity to many people, I'm not saying the biodiversity is nice to have, but in terms of what people want to understand about how nature benefits cities, it's the trees and the landscapes and how they store carbon, how they reduce flood risk, how they reduce the urban heat island effect. So maybe that if we do want to encourage people to learn about biodiversity, that can be used as the hook to draw people in, the habitats and their benefits. If people aren't happy with biodiversity, I guess we can't change some people's minds, but at least they're aware of the benefits that certain habitats can bring for them. Yes.
I was thinking about the schools. Do you have any insights into how the schools across London are ramping up for the GCSE, the National Education Nature Park? What, do you know what's happening?
So the GCSE has been delayed. It's been delayed for 18 months now. It's been sitting in the DfE office, and many people are very frustrated. I'm very frustrated. But I did speak to the people who are implementing that, and I do understand from their point of view that these things take a long time, because GCSEs are, if they're introduced like this, as a singular GCSE, a singular qualification being introduced to the system in this way, it's not part of a wholesale reform, so it's going to take a little bit more time. But I spoke to my headmaster, and I asked him, how are you going to be preparing for the GCSE? And he said, because we don't necessarily have the teachers, the trained teachers, the skills, the equipment to have that timetabling in the middle of the day, we're going to have to host it like astronomy GCSE, like an after-school club. There could be a risk there that people are incentivized from studying it because I have to spend another hour at schools. That's the risk. But I think in the initial stages, any way of getting into schools is good to make that opportunity available. I'm not sure about, if I'm going to be very honest, I'm not sure about schools across London. I have heard good things about Nature Park and how that's getting people involved. I've spoken to the DfE civil servants at last year. They were saying how the schools were very keen, the schools that they consulted were very keen to get that on board. I think like 70 nest boxes for 70 years, things like nature parks are that tactical, immediate solution to help increase people's interest. But then come the GCSE, that will be the main focus. So at least some schools who have engaged with projects like this project and Nature Park would have had some introduction. But from what I've heard, schools are, some I've heard from 2 or 3 schools, they seem to be engaging very well with it. They seem to be enjoying it.
If we do Tim and then so Tim then Earl, and if we can wrap up and give Tim then Quag and Earl, quick questions, and then we need to give Kabir a break because it's nearly 12. Kabir a break. He's been talking for 40 minutes and answering a lot of questions. But so Tim, but fascinating. We could carry on talking all afternoon.
One point and one question. The point is, were you familiar with the lots of bird diversity depends on insect diversity, which is declining. We're familiar with mission invertebrate. In Royal Parks, 5 years, funded by the postcode lottery, we got £5 million and brought in lots of citizen scientists. So the postcode lottery is a potential source. The question is, what difference will the latest BNG, biodiversity net gain legislation, make? It became law on the 12th of February. And in projects like Warren Farm in future, detailed biodiversity estimates will need to be submitted, and local authorities will need to have decent biodiversity officers, and knowledge of this will work down into the general population, we hope. So what difference will that make to nature conservation in London, where lots of the projects, lots of the planning will require BNG assessments?
Yes, so I mean, that's really, really good that there has been that focus on insects in the royal parks and increasing that bit of the word is biomass, so that the birds can thrive there in the royal parks. BNG, no system is perfect. I'll begin by saying that. It is really important. I'm glad it's been introduced, but there are many flaws in that process. With regard to buying and selling carbon credits, I've been learning a little bit about this during my gap year. The carbon credits and BNG credits, management of nature reserves, the management of BNG sites and sites for nature over time. So that there are a number of different flaws, but overall I think it's a really good concept. How will it influence biodiversity in London? I think so long as councils have enough funding, equipment and staff and trained ecologists and trained specialists to make sure that there are enough assessments and thorough assessments, I think it could work very well. But I think there's also the delivery part as well, in that over time, we would need to make sure that these sites are maintained for biodiversity, that there still is a net gain of 10% or over for biodiversity on these different developments across London. And that would be the responsibility of local authorities. But over time, I don't know, priorities of a council might change, funding might not always be there, people might lose interest, contractors may not be given best practice guidance on implementing BNG. So there are many different factors that might affect this over time. But overall, I think on balance, it's a good concept. It's not a perfect system, but I do think it does have the potential to work very well for biodiversity, particularly when it comes to enhancing and expanding existing habitats.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I think I have a very simple, very basic question. I think Stephen mentioned something like that. How do you define green spaces? And do you include natural environment? And also do you include if I can say blue spaces as well? And also the second question is the commitment from young people. In Ghana, we are in my city, we are doing something like that, but I realized students from secondary school, fine. I mean, they can accept in some way, but it's quite difficult dealing with them compared to lower primary, because that is where you can really impact, kind of train and help them to understand nature. So I'm asking how you incorporate lower primary, younger children into accepting or becoming committed to nature.
Yeah. So firstly about green spaces, was the question how do I find green spaces? How is that calculated?
Yes. Because you talked about 47%.
Yeah, so yeah, green spaces, that includes pretty much anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be managed for nature. Could be playing fields, could be parks, could be gardens, could be private gardens as well. So it's both public and private space. And on top of that, there is also what I didn't mention, and perhaps should have mentioned, was that an additional 2% of London is blue space. So that's the Thames, its tributaries, different wetlands and reservoirs. Comparatively a very small percentage, but it is still very important. But still, the figures are still roughly percent. If we say green and blue space, the figures are still roughly the same. That 60% of green and blue space is still not managed for biodiversity. And also lower primary school. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think in lower primary school, what I've seen and what I've heard from teachers, and I think it really does vary. And I think some people in the room may be able to come in on this, but it does vary. It seems to vary by school. Some seem to be really active, really interested in engaging young people, creating a sort of a nature table in the classroom of different things that they found on walks in nature, doing pond dipping exercises to introduce them to nature and the importance of nature conservation, in using ponds as a sort of an outdoor lab. And then so simple activities like that. I went to a school in my local area and they had the space. They were lucky, they were fortunate enough to have the space to create their own nature classroom. So they built their own hut where they could all have outdoor lessons. And then they've also got a pond and some hedgerows as well, which the students help to practically manage throughout the year. So they have to get their hands dirty. There's also a very large forest school movement. So things are picking up the pace, but I don't think that's the case everywhere. Increasingly, I'm seeing that some schools are perhaps struggling. It's not completely black and white, where primary school education is all good and always engaging positively, engaging young people positively with nature. I find the challenge is mainly secondary school, but and perhaps because young people may have developed a better understanding during that time through qualifications like the GCSE of the natural world, they'd be able to get involved with nature conservation more easily. But yes, I do think it does vary by school with regard to how young people in primary school are engaged with nature.
Final question from Earl, if you've got a quick one, and then we'll give Kabir a well-deserved break.
Yeah, I found it interesting, the narrative. Yeah, this is very interesting, and I actually, it's kind of exciting to have someone who is not the kind of older academic or whatever, who's really very dedicated to this kind of work. I think, as you noted, right, this is kind of central. Young people aren't connecting in this way. You can't expect much in the future. But I was interested that you had this kind of rule about it should be run by experts. Nature, in a sense, should be run by experts. And I would say that has a certain resonance. But on the other hand, one of the more, I would say, powerful things that is advancing now in the kind of area of conservation is community-supported conservation. And you have a lot of experience in working with communities, which is also impressive. But I just wonder, how much, this kind of narrative of bringing in the experts to make the decisions kind of thing is actually going to create the opposite of what you hope, which would be broader buy-in and motivation and political capital to do more of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, a really, really good point, that yes, experts should drive it, but I think that there is a caveat that there must be enough community engagement from the bottom up as well. I think experts must engage with that formulation of policy. They must influence the formulation and writing of that policy, and during implementation, we do need to see better oversight from experts, from trained ecologists and specialists. But I think if there are communities that do have a very positive view of nature and really want to get involved with nature conservation, and they love nature and being outdoors, there are some really good examples of this in London. I think that could work really well. I think at the moment, especially in London, there are many top-down initiatives. But what I'm increasingly hearing from, I heard little bits during the Taskforce meetings and from communities around London, is that bottom-up initiatives by the communities are not being highlighted enough. And maybe those need to be more widespread. But I can see that there are many different sources of funding. There's political will, political capital in local authorities as well, helping to support communities. That's the council in Hackney, they actually helped to create, they got their hands dirty and actually helped to create those floating islands. I saw councillors in Hackney helping to put those plants into the islands and taking them out into the canal. That's something you very, very rarely see in London, and actually getting involved with those efforts. And I think if I could use that as an example, the councillors are helping to endorse those initiatives and highlight how communities are getting involved. So I think there are some good initiatives taking place in London from the bottom up, local communities. But if they can be amplified by the work of experts, and they can be aided by the work of experts where necessary, then I think that would make it stronger. But there are already really good initiatives. I think that's a really good point to highlight that. Yes, there are already really good initiatives happening from the bottom up in London, including, for instance, local communities creating floating islands in the Regent's Canal, to highlight one example.
Great. So I just have to say, wow. And thank you. You know, it's a great sign in a talk when the questions just keep coming and keep coming. So thank you so much for dealing with all those questions. You've already achieved some amazing stuff, and I know you'll probably get grabbed afterwards by a number of people that would love to connect with you, and certainly would love to keep the connections going and hear from you as you journey into your undergraduate and who knows what. But it gives us, certainly me personally, a great sense of hope and realization that there's a huge amount of energy happening in communities right in our neighborhoods, and actually thank you for putting our focus on it. So I think, can we all give Kabir a huge round of applause for it? Have a well-deserved coffee. We've got the room for another hour, so have a break, have a drink, and enjoy the rest of the time. But thank you again.
Like what after
Send that along to you.